Hi, my name is Jacinda Zoot. I have been teaching for 15 years at Boyden Hull Elementary. I am in my first year of teaching Title I reading and being the at-risk coordinator. Prior to my current position, I taught first grade for 10 years, and that is where I conducted my research. And my research is over the effectiveness of math worksheets versus hands-on learning. The purpose of my research was to determine whether worksheets, and I will call them traditional learning, or hands-on learning, which I'll refer to as non-traditional learning, has a greater effect on student learning. The reason I chose this research is because I thought there was a better way than workbook pages for students to practice their math skills. I was not excited about the pages, my students weren't excited about doing them, and I knew that not all students learn by using pencil and paper. Ransom and Manning defined worksheets as a piece of paper, a computer screen, or projection that contains problems. There are usually right or wrong answers with these. They might be filling in a bubble, filling in a blank with words, or just circling answers. These worksheets, according to Hack, are easy to administer and correct. There's no engagement or critical thinking skills on this part of the student, and Hack also found that they're a lot of busy work. Usually they are given for students to do while teachers are working with other students. Hands-on activities, small groups, and journaling promote social development. Susie found in her research that students are engaged in their learning when they work with non-traditional learning. And Cami and Lewis found that there's immediate feedback from peers as they work together in groups. And there's a lot more teacher involvement according to Bay, Williams, and Kling while students are working with hands-on activities. The goal of my research was to determine if hands-on activities, small groups, and journaling were more beneficial to student learning than worksheets. The method I used was that my whole class participated in the traditional learning and the non-traditional learning one after the other. My participants were my 13 first grade students that I had in my classroom last fall. I had 10 boys and 3 girls. 3 students were diagnosed with ADHD during that time period, and one of them was treated during the study. I also had 1 resource student. The materials that I used were the first grade Houghton Mifflin math book for the pre-tests and post-tests, and many of the post-tests tested various skills that they learned throughout each chapter, and in various ways. Some fill in the blank, some answering, some circling. And I also use the Math Daily 3 math structure for my non-traditional learning, which is found in the Daily 5 second edition by Bauchi and Mosier. The procedure that I used was that in chapters 1 through 4, students completed the worksheets from the workbook with our math series of Houghton Mifflin. Then once we got to chapter 5, we transitioned into non-traditional learning, teaching the students the structure of Daily 3 and how to work in the math by myself, math with someone, and math writing activities. And we also started in on our small groups. Once we got to chapter 6, we started our complete non-traditional learning in the Math Daily 3 format and continued that through chapter 10. I administered pre-tests and post-tests for each chapter, and that is the data that I collected. And I figured the mean difference for each chapter pre-test and post-test. I also wrote some additional critical thinking questions for each post-test in chapters 1 through 10 for students to complete. These were not figured into the post-test data. These were just for me to read to see if students did display more critical thinking questions with the non-traditional learning or if it was the same as the traditional. I did a dependent t-test to calculate my results of my research, and unfortunately my hypothesis was not confirmed in my research, and the table will show us that. In traditional learning, the mean difference between pre-test and post-test was 28.29. The non-traditional learning was 30.48. Just looking at it makes it look like non-traditional learning was more beneficial. But if we look at the t and p values, they are too high and they are not scientifically significant. But if we look at the standard deviation, In traditional learning, the standard deviation was 13.635. In non-traditional learning, it was 8.755. This tells me that the learning gap was decreased during the non-traditional learning because the number is smaller. Looking at the critical thinking questions, I found that the non-traditional learning was more effective with critical thinking questions, and we will discuss those in some future slides. So what are the implications from this study? Students practice the skills using non-traditional learning. This is more beneficial to their critical thinking skills. Both ways of the learning were effective for the chapter book tests on paper, just answering the questions, but when I required the students to think deeper, the non-traditional was more effective, and it enhanced learning in multiple ways where the students could demonstrate various ways their mastery of each skill. Some examples of the critical thinking questions and answers on the worksheets. One of the questions I wrote was for the students to circle the difference and explain what it means in this subtraction sentence. 8 minus 5 equals 3. Students had difficulty explaining their thinking. Some of them wrote, I don't know. Another one wrote, it is the difference. They couldn't tell me what the 3 meant. They could circle it. A lot of them circled it, but they couldn't tell me what it meant. Another example was a question, how can you find the answer of 4 plus 0? Again, many of the students just told me the answer. One wrote, it equals 4. Another wrote, because 0 is less. So they knew what the answers were, but they could not explain them. With the critical thinking with hands-on learning, small groups, and journals, students had an easier time answering the questions, and they were better answers. Here are some examples. One question was, does this shape have symmetry? Why or why not? One student answered, yes. If I fold it, the squares will all go together. And on this question, explain how you found the difference of 7 minus 4 equals 3. It is very similar to the 4 plus 0 with the traditional thinking where students couldn't explain how they found it. But after participating in the non-traditional learning, they had an easier time answering it. Many explained how they would count back. One student even wrote a story problem with words to explain how she could find 3 for 7 minus 4. She wrote out a whole story problem. And then another example, I asked them to write a sorting rule and draw 3 shapes that followed my rule, or their rule. And one student wrote, I will sort by 4 corners, and she drew a square, a rectangle, and a diamond. So students had a lot better thinking skills when they participated in the non-traditional learning. One way of doing this, they worked in small groups, usually with me, to demonstrate their mastery of a skill. I would constantly ask them what they were thinking, how they solved the problem, what process they went through. So they were constantly thinking about what they were doing in their math, just not the final product, how they got there. I also had reteaching sessions with the students. If they were not able to demonstrate mastery, I would work one-on-one or in even smaller groups with them to practice the skill and to talk through their thinking. They also demonstrated their thinking through journal writing. One round every day they could write in their journals using vocabulary words or writing story problems or anything having to do with the skills that they were learning. Before cleaning up, they were required to explain to either a student or another adult in the room what they wrote in the journal and how they went through their thinking with their writing. So the effects of non-traditional learning that I found in my research did correlate with the research that I did with the literature prior to conducting this study. I did find, like Bay, Williams, and Kling did, that there was increased student-teacher interaction. I was better able to work with the students one-on-one in small groups and be more involved in their learning, and I knew better what their skills were that they needed to work on and skills that they were successful at. And the students just appreciated me being able to work with them more too. Me showing interest in their learning gave them incentive to work even harder. Students were also engaged in their learning, just like Susie had said in my review of the literature. They were excited about their learning, they took ownership, they were motivated by being able to choose what activities they were working on and when. And social skills were also developed. Cammie and Lewis talked about getting feedback from their peers. They could get immediate feedback if they had trouble with a question or if they answered something wrong. Their peers immediately helped them figure out the right answer and talk them through it. They worked on compromise, they explained their thinking, they played fair, and they interacted in positive and educational ways. I also conducted a student survey after the research was completed, asking them if they liked the worksheets or the non-traditional learning with the Daily 3 better. 10 out of 13 of my students preferred the non-traditional learning. 2 of them preferred worksheets, and 1 of my students had moved in between the time where the survey or the study was conducted and the survey was completed. Many of the students said I learned better and it was fun. 1 student said we can choose what to do, and another one said we get to do things different every round of Daily 3. So some limitations that I had. 1 group of students in the population ratio. Having 1 group do this whole study with traditional and non-traditional learning right after each other took quite a long time. If there were 2 groups going at the same time, it wouldn't last as long, and both groups would experience the same external factors at the same time. In my population ratio, 10 boys to 3 girls wasn't quite a great picture of the general population. So I would recommend for future study that 2 groups be participating in the study concurrently, and I would recommend a larger group. 13 students is not very many. And to even out the male to female ratio and general education to special needs ratio. Another limitation was the first grade writing skills. First grade writing skills are not very well established at the beginning of the school year. They're focusing on their writing and their spelling rather than using their journal to enhance their math skills. They get stuck on words, don't know how to write something, and it's interfering with their math learning. So my recommendation would be to conduct the study after the writing skills are established, which would most likely be the 2nd semester. Another limitation would be teacher experience, which doesn't seem like a limitation, but in this case, I think it was a limitation. Experienced teachers know what students need to succeed. They provide for their needs. They're not going to not help in learning, for example, in the worksheet section, because they know that what students need to learn, and they want them to learn in the way that they learn best. So they're not going to deny good education. I think I felt like that. I wasn't going to deny a student their learning just because we were doing worksheets. I would teach them in a different way. Recommendation would maybe be to do this during the summer where it didn't affect grades and it didn't affect what they were learning from one grade to the next. So worksheets versus hands-on learning. The traditional learning, what I found is that it's easier to plan for with the worksheets. It's easier to correct and send home the worksheets daily, and I could keep parents informed very easily. With the non-traditional learning, it was very difficult to create weekly reports. It took a lot of time, and it took a lot of time and effort to create multiple activities for all the skills that the students were working on because they were given choice. But in the end, I feel that the benefit to the students of having those higher critical thinking skills far outweighed the time and the effort that was put into the non-traditional learning. Again, my hypothesis was not supported. Non-traditional and traditional teaching were both effective, but what I did find is that the non-traditional teaching benefited students with their critical thinking skills. So if we would change our math teaching, it will increase deeper thinking skills for students. It would increase cooperative learning skills. It would improve their social skills and increase student motivation and engagement of learning. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I hope you have a great day.